Hey guys, welcome into Political Brawl. Tom Homan just took a wrecking ball to Dana Bash on CNN, and at this point he's exhausted of the accusations and the hysteria around ICE enforcement around the nation, which is precedented and legal. Watch him set the record straight during this tense live sit-down on CNN.
So you are confident that once this operation is over in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, you are confident that you will unearth many more illegal immigrants in the Somali community than people who are there, local officials, state officials, believe actually exist?
Look, we're going to arrest every illegal alien that we find there, but again, we're going to prioritize the public safety threats, national security threats. These are targeted enforcement operations. And, you know, the success has been proven in Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, North Carolina. I mean, every city we've hit, we've arrested a lot of criminal illegal aliens. I looked at the numbers today, you know, by the end of this calendar year, we're going to be around 600,000 deportation, in the majority of them being public safety threats.
Minneapolis, the city, and a councilman there in particular, Jamal Osman, who was born in Somalia, told CNN that, quote, Somali citizens have been stopped on the street, asked to provide documentation, and that he never thought he'd have to tell people to carry their passports around because they look Somali. Are ICE agents stopping people because they look, quote unquote, Somali?
No, they're not. You know, the law requires agents are trained in Fourth Amendment training every 6 months. Border Patrol's trained in Fourth Amendment training. They stop. You can detain and question people for a short period of time based on reasonable suspicion.
That's, and what is that suspicion?
Federal statute.
Is it based on how they look?
No, their appearance alone can't raise reasonable suspicion. It's articulable facts, a lot of different facts taken into consideration. And the Supreme Court just backed the Trump administration up on this. I know a lot of the media says, oh, the Supreme Court just justified racial profiling. That's not what the Supreme Court said. Supreme Court said they agree with the way these operations are being conducted because the standard of reasonable suspicion is being used by both ICE and the Border Patrol in the interior operations.
Mr. Homan, the president said very clearly this week that he doesn't want Somali immigrants in America. He called them garbage. Is that the real reason this operation is happening in the Somali community?
No, I think President Trump's referring to public safety threats as national security threats from Somalia and every other country.
Well, he didn't say that. He said
he's been clear from day one.
He talked about the whole community.
Well, look, I'm not aware what the President Trump was thinking when he said that, but I agree with President Trump. From day one, he has said, we are concentrating on public safety threats and national security threats. He was put in the Oval Office to run the biggest deportation operation this country's ever seen. That's exactly what we're doing. That's what American people voted for. So you know, there's numerous countries that President Trump's, you know, is looking at everybody that came from these countries, make sure they're vetted properly. Some of these countries don't have the proper systems in place to totally vet somebody, so we don't know who they really are. So President Trump's taken upon himself in this administration to make sure anybody that came to this country illegally that we find, and those that came into a vetting process that weren't properly vetted because they don't have the database and information to ensure they're properly vetted, that we're going to relook at those cases and make sure they're properly vetted. And we have all the data we have from them. Some of these countries don't have the databases we have. And some of these countries don't even do the proper checks before they issue a passport to their citizens to come to this country. So President Trump's doing the right thing. Make sure everybody that came in legally came in through proper vetting, especially from countries that are related to terrorism or are somehow related to high numbers of overstays or high number of criminal aliens in this country. That's what he's doing. He's protecting America, and I agree with 100% what he's doing, Dana.
That is the most legitimate and strong concern and argument for taking these enforcement actions and cracking down on the Somali community in specifically, because it's a third world country, just like Afghanistan, just like the other countries on the list that President Trump designated, where we don't have modern record keeping coming from these countries' governments. Their governments change every other week. The Taliban takes over, Al-Shabaab takes over. These are not reliable governments that can provide real, dependable information on these individuals when they're being issued visas or applying for refugee status. A lot of these countries don't even have great law enforcement systems, right? They don't have, what do you think the percentage of people who are murderers or rapists are actually being processed and arrested and brought to justice, and then there exists now a record of that the United States government can use to vet these people? A lot of these places, frankly, just realistically, they're third world countries. They are not very well developed, and they don't have these modern safeguards in place that we can depend on to accurately judge who is coming into this country and making sure they're not domestic security threats, that they don't have anti-American sentiments, etc. So this is really the best concern. I think that Tom Homan here, he's singing this line. This is the correct way to respond to this, and this is true. All Americans should be concerned about who is coming from these countries because of that very reason.
The Department of Homeland Security posted on social media this week that ICE does not arrest or deport U.S. citizens. Released once they found her driver's license in her car that said she was, in fact, a U.S. citizen. So if ICE says it doesn't arrest U.S. citizens, why do we keep seeing incidents like the one I just played, so aggressively pursuing people as they say they are lawfully in America?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I started as Border Patrol in 1984. Through my nearly 4 decades of work, I can't tell you how many times an illegal alien claimed to be a U.S. citizen. It happens all the time. But it's getting back to what I just said. Reasonable suspicion. If they have reasonable suspicion, stop and question somebody and shortly hold them and detain them briefly for questioning. If they have reasonable suspicion, they can stop. So do I think there's been 0 U.S. citizens that have been detained for questioning because the reasonable suspicion said they may be in the country illegally and may have an issue with that? But as soon as that questioning is over, if they're U.S. citizens, they'd be released. It takes probable cause to arrest somebody and actually, transport and take them into custody. So, I'm not aware of these specific cases, Dana. I'm not there, but I'm going to have faith that the ICE agents are gathering articulable facts for reasonable suspicion to detain somebody and question them.
So there's reasonable suspicion that you're talking about. There is releasing somebody once they're comfortable that they are a U.S. citizen. And then there's just the aggressive tactics that we are seeing in video after video. You're comfortable with those tactics that we're all seeing with our own eyes?
See, that's because of the way networks like CNN are covering these ICE actions. I mean, Barack Obama, when he was president, deported up to 5 million people using ICE agents and ICE detention facilities in much the same way that we're seeing here. But the media didn't cover it the same way. They didn't turn it into this big, dramatic Gestapo Nazi takeover, and that's what they're trying to paint this as for obvious political reasons. And I think Tom Homan, who, like he says, he's been a law enforcement and border patrol officer, law enforcement officer since the 80s. That's why he's kind of confused here, because he's like, look, this is how we've always done it. Of course, when we are tasked with arresting massive amounts of people who entered into this country illegally, who broke our immigration laws, there's going to be mistakes made. But as soon as we designate it as a mistake and we say, hey, this person is a legal resident or is a citizen of the United States, they are released. That's the proper process. That's how it's always worked. And no one's ever questioned it up until now that President Trump's in office and they're trying to use it to demonize him. I mean, this is all obvious for us, but CNN, it's almost, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. It's like Dana Bash doesn't realize that that's what her side and her network is painting the narrative as. Look,
threats on ICE officers are up 1,200%. They're being doxxed on social media. They're getting death threats every day. They've been attacked. They've been shot at. And these officers out there look for the worst of the worst. So they're protecting themselves. And I think they're following the law. And if any ICE officer, border patrol agent, acts out of policy or does something inappropriate, they'll be held accountable. But we got to remember, I mean, they're under attack, and we're at a place in this country where all of a sudden the ones who enforce the law are bad guys, and the ones who broke the laws are victims. I'm going to trust the men and women of ICE and Border Patrol who've been trained very well. They're doing the right thing. But I'll say again, if someone does something inappropriate, out of policy, illegal, they need to be held accountable. But I simply think I haven't seen that. And again, I'm not in every arrest. I'm not in every operation. I trust the men and women of ICE and Border Patrol to do the right thing.
There you go. Tom Homan is 100% correct here. And the Democrats are responsible for creating this mess through sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, policies that undermine federal law and deliberately thwart or attempt to thwart President Trump's immigration actions. And a perfect example of that is Ilhan Omar. Watch as she refuses to take responsibility as being a politician elected in Minneapolis for what's going on. She's not allocating responsibility to the people who are actually responsible for defrauding the Minnesota taxpayer. She's now blaming the FBI for this. Take a look.
Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar responding to her state's massive welfare fraud scandal, pinning the blame not on the criminals, but those working to protect the American people.
If there was a linkage in that the money that they had stolen going to terrorism, then that is a failure of the FBI and our court system in not figuring that out and basically charging them.
Host of My View, Laura Trump, joins us now. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. So what do you think about that explanation there? Ilhan Omar saying that if taxpayer money did in fact go to the al-Shabaab terrorist organization, it would be a failing on the part of the FBI for not figuring it out.
Yeah, she sounded super confident in that answer, didn't she, Carly? She could not figure out how she was going to convince people that that was the case, but she said it anyway. It's ridiculous. Of course, the only failure here is from the people who are in leadership positions in Minnesota who allowed this fraud scheme to happen. And I'm looking at Ilhan Omar and I'm looking at Tim Walz, and they really are in the crosshairs of this whole thing. And a lot of people are wondering how it is humanly possible that this was allowed to happen. And this thing is huge. You talk to the White House and they have said, look, this is probably so much bigger and far-reaching than just Minnesota. We know $1 billion was stolen from the taxpayers there in Minnesota. The White House says it actually is probably just scratching the surface. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And, you have the Treasury saying we do have connections through millions of dollars they think was sent to Somalia, and that ultimately did end up in the hands of terrorists, as al-Shabaab terrorists. And so I think that's, of course, a ridiculous answer, but you're going to hear a lot more of that from Ilhan Omar, from Tim Walz. They're going to do a lot of jazz hands and trying to convince people to look the other way, because they are, again, the ones that everyone is looking at and saying, how is it that you were either so grossly incompetent or maybe willfully incompetent that you allowed this to happen in the state of Minnesota? Minnesota deserves better. The American people deserve better. And you know what? The only way they're going to clear their names is by asking for a full-throated, deep investigation and holding those responsible accountable for this.
Yes, that is the next question here is, was Tim Walz and possibly even Ilhan Omar complicit in this scam? Did they know about it? And I think that there's some evidence now that they did know about it. They were aware that this was going on during COVID, and they didn't want to demonize the Somali community by pursuing investigations into what was going on and taking law enforcement action and taking matters into their own hands. That needs to be rectified. And I think that we need to investigate. Thankfully, that is what the Trump administration is planning to do, and hold everybody, especially leaders like Tim Walz, accountable for letting this happen. I mean, can you imagine? Maybe you guys are Minnesotans, if there's Minnesotans in our audience here. You're a taxpayer. What do you think? How do you feel about what happened? You're working hard. You're paying $10, $20, $30, $40,000 a year in taxes, getting raked for taxes everywhere you go. And that money, you're trusting the government to make sure that it goes to your community, to your infrastructure, to your police department. And they let over $1 billion, hundreds of millions, up to $1 billion. And like Laura Trump said, that's probably only scratching the surface. We don't even know what the real number is yet. We have to see when the investigation happens exactly how much taxpayer money was defrauded and ripped off from the taxpayer. But that is one of the most outrageous things I've ever heard. This is one of the biggest scandals in modern American history, certainly in government corruption history. And it's nothing but outrageous and unforgivable, and justice needs to be served to the people responsible for letting this happen. And I think President Trump had a very human reaction to this. Maybe he didn't choose his words perfectly when he said that he doesn't want the Somalis in America. Of course, as Christians, we don't want to paint entire groups as being evil or bad, but I think it is a fair and legitimate concern for Americans to say there are certain countries that have anti-American sentiments, people who have deeply Islamist beliefs. As we uncovered last week, if you go back to polling in the Somali community, some 87% of Somalians believe that Sharia law should be the law of the land. right? And over 90% agree, if not strongly disagree, that Sharia law is the correct way to have a legal system. They agree with the tenets of Sharia law. This is a major problem if we're bringing in tens of thousands of these people and just plopping them into American cities and expecting there to be no downsides to that. That's wishful thinking. That is liberal idealism. It's not reality. And perhaps Ilhan Omar, the only credit I can give her is when she tries to blame the FBI. Of course, she's just deflecting. But I do agree that our own vetting practices are probably insufficient. And that's why we need to pause immigration from these red flag areas around the world that these people are coming from, and we're not able to get accurate information from their government, criminal information, criminal record keeping. We can't really rely on the Taliban or Al-Shabaab or any of the other militant groups or warlords that run these areas to provide the UN or the United States government with real dependable facts about these people. And that scares me. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. If you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.